18-year-old boy with a gift for fixing things changes an old man's life forever with one act of kindness. But what happens next will leave you speechless. A powerful legacy, shocking secrets, and a choice that could alter everything. How does one decision bridge two worlds so different yet deeply connected? Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on future incredible tales. The morning sun peeked through the dusty blinds of the small apartment Elijah Walker called home. The faint scent of fried bacon lingered from the neighbor's kitchen, mixing with the familiar city noise that had already begun to stir outside. Elijah, seated at the worn wooden table, finished the last bite of his slightly burnt toast. Across the room, his mother, Clarice, tightened her scarf before heading to her cleaning job. She paused by the door, her tired eyes softening. "Stay safe out there, Eli," she said with quiet firmness, "and don't let anyone take advantage of you." Elijah nodded, slinging his tattered backpack over his shoulder. "I won't, Ma. Don't worry." As Clarice stepped out, Elijah glanced at his younger sister Jasmine, who was busy playing with her well-loved doll. Her giggles were a rare source of joy in their cramped apartment. She looked up at him, her smile wide. "Don't forget to fix her arm later." Jasmine held up the doll, the missing limb waving like a flag. "Promise, Jazz," Elijah said, ruffling her curls. "I'll make her good as new." Stepping out onto the bustling streets of Atlanta, Elijah was greeted by the chaos of honking horns, the hum of conversations, and the occasional bark of a stray dog. The morning air was crisp, but already smelled faintly of car exhaust. Slinging his backpack higher, Elijah walked to his usual spot at the intersection a few blocks away, a place where he spent hours cleaning windshields to help make ends meet. The routine was familiar, drivers pulling up, some nodding in acknowledgement, others waving him off. Elijah worked with precision and speed, grateful for every coin tossed his way. But today, something broke through the rhythm. A loud honk echoed, followed by the screech of brakes. Elijah's head snapped up. In the middle of the street was an elderly man in a motorized wheelchair. The chair had stalled and cars were piling up behind him. Drivers leaned on their horns, some yelling out their windows. The man, pale and visibly panicked, glanced around helplessly as the traffic inched closer. Without thinking, Elijah dropped his rag and sprinted toward the man. The city sounds blurred as his focus sharpened on the wheelchair. The honks became sharper, the shouts angrier. Elijah ignored them all. "Hold on, sir," he called out, his voice steady despite the chaos. The wheelchair was heavier than he expected, its wheels locked in place. Elijah gritted his teeth, gripping the handles tightly, and began pushing with all his strength. The chair moved inch by inch, the uneven asphalt resisting his every effort. The sound of engines revving behind him pushed Elijah to move faster. Finally, the two reached the curb. The elderly man exhaled deeply, his trembling hands gripping the armrests of the wheelchair. Elijah crouched to catch his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Sweat dripped from his forehead onto the pavement. "Thank you, son," the man said, his voice weak but sincere. "I didn't know what to do." Elijah looked up, his gaze meeting the man's pale, weary eyes. "It's all right, sir. Are you hurt?" The man shook his head slowly. "No, but I think the chair's controls are stuck." Elijah stood and studied the wheelchair. The control panel had a small button that appeared jammed. He reached into his backpack, pulling out a battered multi-tool. With careful hands, he adjusted the wiring and loosened the stuck button. Moments later, the wheelchair hummed softly as it powered back on. "There you go," Elijah said with a small smile. "Should be working now." The man tested the controls, his face breaking into a relieved smile as the chair moved forward and back smoothly. "You've got quite a talent, young man. I don't know how to thank you." Elijah waved it off. "No need, sir. I was just glad to help." The man extended a trembling hand. "My name's Franklin Hollis." "Elijah Walker," he replied, shaking Franklin's hand firmly. Franklin looked at Elijah with a mix of gratitude and curiosity. "Would you mind walking me home? I don't live far, but I'd feel better with someone along." Elijah hesitated. He glanced back at the intersection. where a few drivers were waiting for their windshields to be cleaned. His work meant income for his family. But Franklin's frailty and earnest request struck a chord. "Sure," Elijah said, hoisting his backpack onto his shoulder. "Let's get you home." As they walked, Franklin spoke in fragmented sentences about his late wife, the importance of independence, and the challenges of old age. Elijah listened quietly, his respect for the man growing with every step. The streets they navigated became cleaner, the houses larger and more elaborate. By the time they arrived at Franklin's home, Elijah stopped in his tracks. The house was enormous, a sprawling estate surrounded by wrought iron gates and manicured hedges. The sun reflected off the windows, casting a warm glow on the pristine stone walls. Elijah had never seen anything like it. "This is your home?" Elijah asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Franklin chuckled. "It is. Come inside for a moment. I'd like to thank you properly." Elijah shook his head, his modest upbringing urging him to decline. "I should get back to work, sir. My family's counting on me." Franklin frowned but nodded. "All right. But if you ever need anything, please don't hesitate to ask." Elijah offered a polite smile and turned to leave. As he walked back to the intersection, the image of Franklin's grand house lingered in his mind, a world so far removed from his own. For a brief moment, he had stepped into it, unaware that this moment of kindness was about to change his life forever. Elijah couldn't shake the image of Franklin's house as he made his way back to the intersection. The grand estate, with its sprawling lawns and towering gates, was a stark contrast to his reality. It wasn't just the house. It was the feeling of stepping into a world so far removed from his own. A world of polished floors and refined elegance, where the weight of survival didn't rest so heavily on every breath. As the day wore on, Elijah returned to cleaning windshields, his thoughts occasionally drifting to Franklin. The man's kind eyes and genuine gratitude had left an impression, but the grand house lingered in his mind like a stubborn echo. By the time he returned home, the streets were already cloaked in shadows, and the hum of activity in their neighborhood had settled into the quieter rhythm of the evening. Inside their small apartment, Clarice was setting the table while Jasmine hummed softly, her doll cradled in her arms. "How was work?" Clarice asked, her tone carrying both curiosity and weariness. Elijah hesitated, deciding how much to share. "It was different today," he said finally, setting his backpack down by the door. "I helped an older man whose wheelchair broke in the middle of the street." Clarice turned, her brow furrowing. "Was he okay?" "Yeah, he's fine," Elijah replied, taking a seat at the table. "I fixed the chair and walked him home. His house was huge, Ma. Like something out of a movie." Jasmine's eyes lit up. "Did it have a pool? A big one?" Elijah chuckled softly. "I didn't see a pool, Jazz, but the house itself was incredible." Clarice placed a bowl of steaming rice on the table and sat across from him, her expression cautious. "Eli, you need to be careful. People with money, they don't always have the best intentions. They might seem kind, but they don't live in our world." Elijah nodded, understanding her concern. "I know, Ma. He didn't seem like that, though. He was different. I think he just needed someone to care." Before Clarice could respond, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Elijah frowned, exchanging a quick glance with his mother before getting up to answer. When he opened the door, he was greeted by a familiar face. "Franklin?" Elijah said, surprised. Standing in the dim hallway, Franklin offered a warm smile, his posture slightly stooped, but his presence commanding. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I just wanted to thank you properly for your kindness earlier, and—" His gaze shifted behind Elijah to the modest interior of their home. "I thought it might be nice to invite you and your family to dinner at my place." Clarice appeared behind Elijah, her arms crossed protectively. "Dinner?" she asked, her tone skeptical. "Why?" Franklin met her gaze steadily. "Your son helped me in a moment when I truly needed it. He could have walked away, but he didn't. I'd like to return the kindness." Clarice hesitated, her eyes scanning Franklin for any hint of insincerity. "I appreciate the gesture, but we don't want to impose." Franklin shook his head. "It's no imposition, I assure you. Please think of it as my way of expressing gratitude." Elijah glanced at his mother, seeing the doubt flicker in her eyes. He understood her reluctance. Their lives didn't often intersect with people like Franklin. But there was something genuine about the old man, something that felt different from the guarded faces they usually encountered. "Ma, it's just dinner," Elijah said softly. "We'll go, and if it feels off, we'll leave." Clarice sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "All right," she said, her voice reluctant but resigned. "But just this once." Franklin's face brightened. "Wonderful. I'll send a car to pick you up tomorrow evening at 7. It'll be a pleasure to have you all." As Franklin left, Elijah closed the door and turned back to his mother and sister. Jasmine was already bubbling with excitement, asking if she could wear her favorite dress, while Clarice sat quietly, her thoughts clearly racing. "This doesn't feel right," she said finally, her voice low. "People like him, they don't just give without expecting something in return." "I get it, Ma," Elijah said, sitting beside her. "But what if he's just being kind? Not everyone's out to take advantage, and maybe this could be a chance for us to see something different, even just for one night." Clarice looked at him, her expression softening. She reached out, placing a hand on his. "Promise me, Eli, if anything feels wrong, we leave. No questions." Elijah nodded. "I promise." The next day, as the clock approached 7, Elijah found himself standing in their small living room, adjusting the collar of his shirt. Jasmine twirled in her favorite dress, giggling at the way the skirt flared out. Clarice emerged from the bedroom, her hair neatly tied back, wearing the nicest blouse she owned. The knock at the door came right on time. When Elijah opened it, a sharply dressed driver greeted them with a polite nod. "Mr. Hollis sent me to escort you to his home," he said, gesturing to the sleek black car waiting outside. As they climbed into the car, Elijah felt a mixture of excitement and unease. The soft hum of the engine and the plush leather seats were worlds apart from their usual reality. Jasmine marveled at the passing city lights, her face pressed against the window, while Clarice sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Elijah glanced at his mother, then back out the window. He couldn't shake the feeling that this dinner would be more than just a simple meal. It would be the beginning of something much bigger. The sleek black car rolled to a gentle stop in front of Franklin's estate, its headlights cutting through the quiet evening. Elijah stepped out first, holding the door for his mother and sister. Jasmine's eyes widened as she took in the grand gates, the lush gardens beyond, and the towering house that seemed to glow softly under the warm exterior lights. Clarice followed hesitantly, her shoulders tense as she scanned the property. Despite her misgivings, there was no denying the elegance surrounding them. The front door opened before they could knock. Franklin appeared, his wheelchair humming softly as he approached. His smile was warm, and the lines on his face seemed less weary under the soft glow of the chandelier behind him. "Welcome," Franklin said, his voice carrying a genuine warmth. "Please, come in." Elijah glanced at his mother, seeking reassurance. Clarice nodded slightly, her hand resting on Jasmine's shoulder as they stepped inside. The foyer was breathtaking, with polished wood floors that gleamed under the light of a crystal chandelier. The walls were lined with framed photographs, many featuring a younger Franklin with a woman who must have been his wife. There was a quiet elegance to the home, but also a sense of history, of lives lived within its walls. "This is incredible," Jasmine whispered, her voice filled with wonder. Franklin chuckled, his eyes twinkling as he looked at her. "Thank you, young lady. It's been my home for many years." Clarice, however, remained guarded. Her gaze flicked from Franklin to the surroundings, searching for hidden motives. Elijah could feel her unease, but he couldn't help but be drawn in by the old man's sincerity. Dinner was served in a spacious dining room, the table adorned with fine china and flickering candles. A housekeeper moved quietly around them, placing dishes of roasted chicken, fresh vegetables, and warm bread on the table. The aroma filled the room, making Elijah's stomach growl softly. Jasmine giggled, nudging him under the table. Franklin led the conversation, asking Elijah about his interests and dreams. At first hesitant, Elijah eventually opened up about his love for fixing things, bicycles, radios, even an old toaster he had repaired for a neighbor. As he spoke, he noticed Franklin listening intently. his expression thoughtful. Engineering, perhaps? Franklin suggested, his tone encouraging. You seem to have the knack for it. Elijah hesitated, glancing at Clarice. I've thought about it, he admitted. But college, it's expensive, and right now my family needs me. Franklin nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to Clarice. You've raised a fine young man, Mrs. Walker. It's not every day you meet someone with Elijah's determination and heart. Clarice stiffened slightly at the compliment, unsure of how to respond. He does his best, she said simply, her tone cautious. The evening seemed to be going smoothly until the dining room door opened and another figure entered. David Hollis, Franklin's son, stepped into the room with an air of authority. His sharp suit and piercing gaze immediately shifted the atmosphere. He stopped short when he saw Elijah and his family, his brows knitting together. Father, David said, his tone clipped. You didn't mention we were having guests. Franklin's expression didn't falter. David, this is Elijah Walker and his family. Elijah helped me yesterday when my wheelchair broke down. David's gaze shifted to Elijah, cool and assessing. I see. He took a seat at the far end of the table, his posture rigid. And what brings you here tonight, Elijah? Elijah felt his throat tighten under David's scrutiny, but Franklin interjected smoothly. I invited them. Elijah has a gift for mechanics, and I thought it would be nice to show him my gratitude. David's expression remained unreadable, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his voice. Interesting. The rest of the dinner passed with a subtle unease lingering in the air. While Franklin continued to engage Elijah and Jasmine with warmth, David's cold presence was a constant reminder of the divide between their worlds. Clarice stayed mostly quiet, her wary eyes darting between Franklin and his son. As the meal ended, Franklin invited Elijah to join him in his study. Clarice hesitated but eventually agreed, allowing Elijah to go ahead. The study was a cozy room filled with bookshelves, a worn leather chair, and a desk cluttered with papers. Franklin wheeled himself to the desk, gesturing for Elijah to take a seat. You've got potential, Elijah, Franklin said, his tone serious. Not just as a mechanic, but as someone who can make a real difference. I want to help you develop that potential. Elijah blinked, unsure of what to say. I appreciate that, Mr. Hollis, but I don't know if I can. Franklin held up a hand. I'm not asking for an answer now, just think about it. The world needs more young men like you. As they left the study and rejoined Clarice and Jasmine, Elijah couldn't help but feel a mix of gratitude and unease. Franklin's kindness seemed genuine, but the coldness in David's eyes left a lingering doubt. As they rode home in the car, Clarice finally spoke. I don't trust it, she said quietly. I don't trust people who have everything and still want more. Elijah stared out the window, his mind racing. He wanted to believe in Franklin's sincerity, but his mother's words clung to him like a shadow. For the first time, he wondered if stepping into this world might come with a cost he wasn't prepared to pay. The sleek black car glided through the darkened streets, carrying Elijah, Clarice, and Jasmine back home. The ride was quiet except for Jasmine's excited chatter about Franklin's mansion and the elegant dinner. Clarice remained silent, her arms folded tightly as she stared out the window. Elijah leaned back, the weight of Franklin's words and David's cold demeanor pressing heavily on his mind. I don't trust it, Clarice had said earlier. Those words lingered, warning him not to get swept away by promises that might come with strings attached. But Franklin's sincerity still shone through, leaving Elijah torn between hope and caution. The next evening, the Walkers once again found themselves at Franklin's estate. This time, the atmosphere was slightly different. The grandeur of the home was no less striking, but there was a quiet tension that seemed to settle over the room like an invisible fog. Franklin greeted them warmly at the door, his smile as kind as ever. I'm so glad you could make it again, he said, his voice rich with genuine warmth. Tonight's dinner will be something special. As they stepped inside, Clarice's cautious gaze lingered on the lavish decor. Jasmine, however, couldn't contain her awe, her small hands brushing against the polished banister of the staircase. Elijah followed Franklin into the dining room, where the long table was set with fine china and silver candlesticks. The table gleamed under the soft glow of a chandelier, and the aroma of roasted lamb filled the air. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," Franklin said, gesturing toward the seats near the head of the table. "Dinner will be served shortly." Clarice sat stiffly, her hands resting on her lap, while Jasmine eagerly climbed into her seat, her wide eyes scanning the room. Elijah couldn't help but feel the contrast between this world of elegance and their modest apartment. It wasn't just the surroundings, it was the unspoken rules, the silent judgments that seemed to hang in the air. As the first course was served, Franklin turned his attention to Elijah. "So, Elijah," he began, his tone conversational, "have you given any thought to what we discussed yesterday?" Elijah hesitated, his fork hovering over his plate. "A little," he admitted. "It's a lot to think about." Franklin nodded, his expression understanding. "Take your time. Big decisions shouldn't be rushed." Before the conversation could continue, the door to the dining room opened and David entered. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. His tailored suit and confident stride exuded authority, but his sharp gaze carried an edge of skepticism. "Father," David said, his tone formal, "I see you're entertaining again." Franklin's smile didn't waver. "David, join us. I was just getting to know Elijah better." David's eyes flicked to Elijah, then to Clarice and Jasmine. "Interesting choice of guests," he said, his words carefully measured but not entirely free of judgment. Elijah felt Clarice tense beside him, her protective instincts kicking in. Jasmine, oblivious to the undertones, focused on her plate with the enthusiasm only a child could muster. Elijah met David's gaze, his nerves bubbling under the surface but refusing to break. "We're here because your father invited us," Elijah said, keeping his voice steady. "He's been very kind to us." David's expression didn't soften, but he inclined his head slightly. "My father is known for his generosity." The tension at the table was palpable as the main course was served. Franklin, ever the gracious host, steered the conversation back to safer topics, asking Jasmine about school and Clarice about her work. But the unease lingered, David's presence casting a shadow over the warmth Franklin tried to create. After dessert, Franklin invited Elijah to join him in the study again. This time, Clarice rose to her feet. "I'd like to come too," she said firmly. Franklin hesitated but nodded. "Of course." In the study, Franklin handed Elijah a small folder. "This is some information about a potential internship at my company," he explained. "I think it would be a good opportunity for you to develop your skills." Elijah opened the folder, his eyes scanning the neatly printed documents. The words felt heavy, each line carrying the weight of possibility. He glanced at Clarice, who stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "What would this involve?" Elijah asked. Franklin smiled gently. "It's a starting point, hands-on experience, training, and exposure to a professional environment. It could lead to bigger things." Clarice stepped forward. "And what do you expect in return?" she asked bluntly. Franklin's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Nothing more than Elijah's commitment to learning and growing. I see potential in him, and I want to help him realize it." Clarice studied him for a long moment before nodding. "We'll think about it." As they left the study, David watched them from the end of the hall, his expression unreadable. Elijah felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about David that made him uneasy, a sense that he was constantly being assessed, weighed, and perhaps found wanting. Back in the car, Clarice broke the silence. "This is too much, Elijah. Opportunities like this don't come without a price." Elijah stared out the window, his thoughts swirling. Franklin's kindness felt genuine, but David's presence cast a long shadow. Could he really trust this opportunity, or was his mother right to be wary? As the car pulled into their neighborhood, Elijah looked at his mother. "I'll think it through, Ma," he said softly. "I promise." Clarice nodded, her worry etched into her face. "Just remember, Eli, not all that glitters is gold." As the car pulled away from Franklin's estate, Elijah leaned his head against the window, the passing street lights reflecting off the glass. The folder Franklin had handed him felt heavier than it should, as if it carried more than just an internship opportunity. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Opportunities like this don't come without a price. Yet, despite her warning, Elijah couldn't deny the spark of hope that Franklin's offer had ignited. The next morning, Elijah went about his usual routine at the intersection. The crisp morning air carried the scent of asphalt and exhaust as he cleaned windshields and exchanged polite words with hurried drivers. His hands moved automatically, but his thoughts remained elsewhere, replaying the events of the previous night. The warmth of Franklin's encouragement clashed with the cold detachment of David's gaze, leaving Elijah caught in a web of uncertainty. As the sun climbed higher, Elijah spotted a sleek black car pulling up to the curb. His heart sank and raced simultaneously. The driver stepped out and opened the back door. To Elijah's surprise, it was not Franklin but David who emerged, his sharp suit pristine as always. David's eyes scanned the intersection before landing on Elijah. "Elijah," David called, his tone neutral but firm. "A moment of your time?" Elijah hesitated, his rag clenched tightly in his hand. The other drivers honked impatiently, but curiosity and caution won over. He walked toward David, stopping a few feet away. "Mr. Hollis," Elijah said, trying to keep his voice steady. David gestured toward the car. "Get in, we need to talk." The request or command caught Elijah off guard. He glanced back at the intersection, then at David. "I've got work to do," he said cautiously. "This won't take long," David replied. His expression softened slightly, but his tone left no room for argument. Reluctantly, Elijah slid into the back seat of the car. The door closed with a soft thud, sealing him into the cool, leather-lined interior. David sat across from him, his posture straight and commanding. A folder rested on the seat between them. "I'll get straight to the point," David began, his piercing gaze fixed on Elijah. "My father sees potential in you. He's always had a soft spot for idealistic causes, but potential alone isn't enough. It has to be tested." Elijah frowned, unsure of where this was going. "What do you mean?" David leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "We're prepared to offer you an internship at Hollis Innovations. It's an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to prove yourself. But," he slid the folder toward Elijah, "it comes with terms." Elijah opened the folder, his eyes scanning the neatly typed pages. The terms outlined a paid internship with training and mentorship. But at the bottom, one clause stood out: a 5-year commitment to the company upon completion of the program. Elijah's heart sank. "5 years?" Elijah asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. David nodded. "A fair exchange for the resources and time we'll invest in you. Stability and opportunity don't come without commitment, Elijah. It's a chance to build a future for yourself and your family." Elijah's hands trembled slightly as he closed the folder. "I don't know," he said honestly. "That's a long time." David's expression didn't change. "It is. But it's also a chance to escape the limitations of your current situation. My father believes in you, but I need to know if you believe in yourself enough to take this seriously." Elijah looked out the window, his mind racing. The opportunity was undeniable, but so were the strings attached. He thought of his mother, of Jasmine, and of the weight he carried for them every day. Could he take this step without losing himself in the process? "I need time to think about it," Elijah said finally, meeting David's gaze. David nodded curtly. "Take the weekend. But remember, opportunities like this don't come around often." The car pulled back to the intersection, and Elijah stepped out, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. As the car drove away, the weight of the decision settled heavily on his shoulders. The rest of the day passed in a blur, his usual rhythm disrupted by the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. That evening, Elijah sat at the kitchen table, the folder open in front of him. Clarice stood at the stove, stirring a pot of beans and rice, her expression tense as she glanced at him. "What's that?" she asked, her voice cautious. Elijah hesitated. "It's an internship offer at Franklin's company." Clarice turned, her brows knitting together. "What's the catch?" Elijah sighed, pointing to the clause. 5 years. I'd have to commit to working for them for 5 years after the internship." Clarice's frown deepened. 5 years is a long time, Eli. Are you sure about this? I don't know, Elijah admitted, his voice low. It's a big chance, Ma, but I'm not sure if it's the right one. Clarice sat down across from him, her hand covering his. Listen to your heart, Eli. Don't let them trap you into something that takes more than it gives. Elijah nodded, her words settling into his chest like a steady beat. As the night wore on, he stared at the folder, torn between the promise of opportunity and the fear of losing his freedom. The weekend passed with Elijah wrestling over the weight of David's offer. The folder lay untouched on the kitchen table, its contents both promising and daunting. Clarice's words replayed in his mind. Don't let them trap you into something that takes more than it gives. But Franklin's voice also lingered, genuine, warm, filled with encouragement. Elijah knew that opportunities like this didn't come easily for someone in his position. By Monday morning, Elijah made up his mind. He couldn't commit to the 5-year clause, not yet, but he wasn't ready to close the door entirely. He decided he would test the waters, figure out if this world was one he could navigate without losing himself. With that resolve, he called the number Franklin had given him, agreeing to a trial period for the internship. The next day, Elijah stood outside Hollis Innovations, a sleek office building with mirrored windows reflecting the bustling city of Atlanta. The structure felt intimidating, a far cry from the streets he knew so well. Adjusting the collar of his borrowed shirt, he took a deep breath and stepped inside. The lobby was pristine, its marble floors gleaming under recessed lighting. A receptionist greeted him with a professional smile. "You must be Elijah Walker," she said, handing him a visitor's badge. "Head to the 3rd floor. Someone will meet you there." Elijah's heart pounded as he entered the elevator, the soft hum of its ascent amplifying his nerves. When the doors opened, he was met by a young man with a friendly smile. "Elijah, right? I'm Miles. I'll be showing you around today." Miles's casual demeanor immediately put Elijah at ease. As they walked through the office, Miles explained the layout, introducing Elijah to different departments and their roles. "We'll start you with something simple," Miles said, stopping at a desk near the corner of the open office space. "Here's your workstation. Today you'll be helping organize inventory logs and updating our database. Nothing too intense." Elijah nodded, relieved to have a clear task. He settled into the chair, his hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The software was unlike anything he had used before, but Miles walked him through the basics, answering questions patiently. As Elijah worked, the rhythm of data entry began to feel familiar, his focus sharpening with each completed entry. Around midday, Miles returned with 2 sandwiches. "Figured you might need a break," he said, handing one to Elijah. "So, how's your first day going?" "It's different," Elijah admitted, unwrapping the sandwich. "I've never worked in a place like this before." Miles chuckled. "It takes some getting used to, but you're doing great for your first day. Most interns take a week just to figure out the system." Elijah smiled, the praise bolstering his confidence. "Thanks. I just don't want to mess this up." "You won't," Miles said firmly. "Just keep asking questions when you're unsure. That's the key." The afternoon brought its own challenges. One of the files Elijah was working on contained discrepancies that he didn't know how to resolve. He hesitated, debating whether to ask for help or try to figure it out himself. Finally, he approached Miles, showing him the issue. "Good catch," Miles said, nodding as he reviewed the file. "This could have caused a mess later. Always flag stuff like this. It's better to double-check than let it slide." Elijah returned to his desk with a sense of accomplishment. Though the work was far from glamorous, it felt purposeful, a small but meaningful contribution. As the day wound down, Elijah gathered his things and prepared to leave. On his way out, he ran into David, who was speaking with another executive near the elevators. David's sharp gaze landed on Elijah, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Walker," David said, his tone formal. "How was your first day?" Elijah straightened, meeting David's gaze. "It went well, sir. I'm still learning, but I think I'm getting the hang of it." David nodded slightly. "Good. Let's see if you can keep up." His words carried a hint of challenge. But Elijah refused to be intimidated. As Elijah stepped outside into the evening air, a wave of exhaustion washed over him. Yet, beneath the fatigue, was a quiet sense of pride. He had survived his first day in a world that had once felt unreachable. When he returned home, Jasmine greeted him with a tight hug, her excitement bubbling over. "How was it, Gabby? Did you fix anything cool?" Elijah chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Not yet, Jazz, but maybe soon." Clarice stood by the stove, her eyes scanning his face for clues. "Well?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "It was good," Elijah said, setting his bag down. "It's a lot to take in, but I think I can handle it." Clarice nodded, her expression softening. "Just don't let them push you too hard, remember. You're there to learn, not to be used." "I know, Ma," Elijah said, pulling out his chair at the table. "I'll be careful." That night, as he lay in bed, Elijah stared at the ceiling, his thoughts drifting to Franklin's encouragement and David's scrutiny. He didn't know where this path would lead, but for now he was determined to walk it on his own terms. Elijah's first days at Hollis Innovations blurred into a whirlwind of new responsibilities and steep learning curves. Each evening he returned home tired but quietly proud, sharing snippets of his day with Clarice and Jasmine. His mother remained cautious, often reminding him to guard his trust, while Jasmine continued to pepper him with curious questions, her bright eyes reflecting a belief that her big brother could do anything. One evening, as Elijah finished recounting an anecdote about a particularly tricky database issue he resolved, the phone rang. The old rotary phone on the counter buzzed sharply, jolting the small family from their moment of calm. Clarice answered, her face immediately darkening as she listened. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice strained. "When? Is he—" She stopped mid-sentence, her free hand gripping the counter for support. Elijah and Jasmine froze, watching her intently. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Clarice said quickly before hanging up. She turned to Elijah, her expression a mixture of fear and urgency. "It's Uncle Roy," she said, her voice trembling. "He's been in an accident. They said it's bad." Elijah's heart sank. Uncle Roy was Clarice's younger brother and one of the few family members who stayed in regular contact. He had always been a quiet but steady presence in their lives, often bringing small gifts for Jasmine and lending a hand when they needed help. "Where is he?" Elijah asked, already grabbing his jacket. "Grady Memorial," Clarice replied. "I need to go." "I'm coming with you," Elijah interrupted, his voice firm. Clarice hesitated but nodded, grateful for his support. They left Jasmine with a trusted neighbor and hurried to the hospital, their footsteps echoing in the quiet halls as they made their way to the emergency room. The scene inside was chaotic. Nurses rushing, monitors beeping, and worried families huddled in corners. A nurse directed them to the trauma unit, where they found Roy unconscious, his face bruised and pale. Machines beeped steadily around him, and an IV drip hung by his side. "What happened?" Clarice asked the nurse stationed nearby, her voice cracking. "Car accident," the nurse explained. "He was hit by a drunk driver. He's stable for now, but his injuries are severe. Broken ribs, internal bleeding. We're monitoring him closely." Clarice sank into the nearest chair, her hand covering her mouth. Elijah stood frozen, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his chest. He had always seen Roy as strong, a steady figure in their unstable world. Seeing him like this was jarring, almost surreal. As the hours passed, Clarice stayed by Roy's side, holding his hand and murmuring soft prayers. Elijah stepped out into the corridor, pacing as he tried to process everything. The hum of fluorescent lights above seemed deafening in the otherwise still hallway. The reality of their fragile circumstances hit him harder than ever. Medical bills, missed workdays. This crisis would ripple through their lives in ways he couldn't yet predict. He clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. They couldn't afford this, but there was no option but to face it head on. Later that night, as they returned home, Clarice's exhaustion was palpable. She slumped onto the couch, her face etched with worry. Jasmine, who had fallen asleep waiting for them, stirred as Elijah gently carried her to bed. Sitting beside his mother, Elijah broke the silence. "We'll figure this out, Ma. We always do." Clarice shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Roy's going to need help, Elijah. I don't know how we'll manage. His job won't pay him while he's out, and..." Her voice faltered, and she buried her face in her hands. Elijah placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this. I'll do whatever it takes." The next morning, Elijah arrived at Hollis Innovations, his mind heavy with the weight of his family's crisis. He worked diligently, trying to bury his emotions in tasks, but his distraction didn't go unnoticed. Miles, his mentor, approached him during their lunch break. "You okay?" Miles asked, his tone genuine. "You seem off today." Elijah hesitated but eventually nodded. "It's family stuff. My uncle was in an accident and things are tough." Miles nodded sympathetically. "That's rough. If you need to take some time—" "I can't," Elijah interrupted. "This job is part of how I help them. I can't afford to stop." Miles didn't press further but offered a reassuring pat on Elijah's shoulder. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here." Later that day, as Elijah organized inventory files, Franklin appeared in the office. His presence was unexpected but welcome. His kind smile a stark contrast to David's calculating demeanor. He stopped by Elijah's desk, leaning forward slightly. "How's the internship treating you so far?" Franklin asked warmly. "It's going well," Elijah replied, managing a small smile despite his inner turmoil. Franklin studied him for a moment, his expression softening. "You seem preoccupied. Is everything all right?" Elijah hesitated, unsure whether to open up. Finally, he nodded slowly. "It's my uncle. He's in the hospital after an accident. It's been a lot." Franklin's brow furrowed, and he placed a reassuring hand on Elijah's desk. "If there's anything I can do, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Elijah said, his voice sincere. "It means a lot." As Franklin walked away, Elijah's thoughts churned. His family's challenges had always been theirs to bear alone, but for the first time there was a glimmer of support from someone outside their small circle. Whether or not he could trust it remained to be seen. The weight of Roy's accident lingered in Elijah's mind as he navigated another day at Hollis Innovations. He tried to focus, but the growing pile of medical bills and the strain on his mother's face loomed large in his thoughts. Every moment spent at work felt like a race against time, a chance to earn just enough to keep his family afloat. By mid-morning, a new task landed on Elijah's desk, a shipment inventory report that needed updating. It was straightforward but crucial, and Miles made it clear that accuracy was non-negotiable. Elijah dove into the task, determined to prove himself amidst his personal struggles. But not everyone was rooting for him. Carter, a senior employee known for his condescending attitude, loomed near Elijah's desk. Carter had made no effort to hide his disdain for Elijah since day one, his remarks ranging from backhanded compliments to outright dismissiveness. Today was no different. "Careful with that," Carter said, leaning over Elijah's shoulder. "One mistake, and the whole department could be scrambling." Elijah stiffened, but kept his eyes on the screen. "I've got it covered," he replied evenly. Carter snorted. "Sure you do. Just don't forget who's cleaning up if you mess it up." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he refused to rise to the bait. He focused on completing the report, double-checking every entry before submitting it to Miles for review. The day seemed to smooth out until just before lunch, when Miles approached Elijah, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with visible tension. "Elijah," Miles began, holding a printed report. "The inventory file you submitted, it's got errors, big ones." Elijah's heart dropped. "What? That can't be right. I checked everything." Miles handed him the report. "The system flagged a mismatch between the shipment and the database. It's throwing off the logistics for the week." Elijah scanned the pages, his stomach churning. The errors were glaring, entries he didn't remember making, discrepancies that hadn't existed when he finished the report. He shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "I didn't do this, Miles, I swear." Miles studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Let's figure it out. Retrace your steps and see if we can catch where it went wrong." Elijah spent the rest of the afternoon poring over the file, but the mistakes didn't add up. His frustration grew, fueled by the nagging suspicion that this wasn't a simple error. Carter's smirk as he walked by only deepened Elijah's doubts. By the end of the day, Elijah approached Miles again, his voice low but firm. "I think someone tampered with the file." Miles raised an eyebrow. "That's a serious accusation, Elijah." "I know, Elijah admitted, but I've been careful. I wouldn't make these kinds of mistakes, and Carter's been hovering around my desk all week. Miles frowned, his expression shifting to concern. Carter? He's been here for years. I'll look into it, but be careful. Office politics can get messy. The conversation left Elijah uneasy, but he resolved not to back down. If someone was trying to sabotage him, he wouldn't let it ruin the opportunity he was fighting so hard to make the most of. The following morning, Franklin made another unannounced visit to the office. Elijah's heart sank at the thought of Franklin hearing about the inventory fiasco, but the older man greeted him with his usual warmth. Good morning, Elijah, Franklin said, wheeling over to his desk. How's everything going? Elijah hesitated, unsure of how much to share. It's been a learning curve, he said finally. Franklin nodded knowingly. It always is. Just remember, mistakes are part of the process. What matters is how you handle them. Franklin's words bolstered Elijah's resolve. That afternoon, he doubled down on his efforts to uncover the truth. He carefully reviewed the office's shared files and logs, looking for anything out of place. His patience paid off when he found a discrepancy in the access logs. Someone had opened the inventory file after he submitted it. The timestamp pointed directly to Carter. Armed with evidence, Elijah brought the discovery to Miles. Miles's eyes widened as he reviewed the logs, his expression shifting from doubt to determination. This changes everything, he said. Let me handle it. By the end of the day, Carter was called into a meeting with Miles and the department head. Elijah didn't hear the details, but Carter's thunderous expression as he stormed out of the office told him enough. Later, Miles stopped by Elijah's desk. You did good, Elijah, Miles said, a rare seriousness in his tone. Not everyone would have handled this as calmly as you did. Relief washed over Elijah, but so did a deeper resolve. The incident had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, but it also reminded him of the stakes, not just for him, but for his family. That evening, Elijah returned home to find Clarice sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through a stack of bills. She looked up as he walked in, her face tired but hopeful. How was work? She asked. Elijah set down his bag and smiled faintly. Tough, but I handled it. Clarice nodded, her expression softening. That's all we can do, Eli. One step at a time. As Elijah sat down beside her, he thought about the days ahead. The road wasn't getting any easier, but for the first time, he felt like he had the tools to navigate it. The fallout from the sabotage incident left Elijah feeling both vindicated and cautious. Carter's departure had lifted a weight off his shoulders, but it also sent ripples through the office. Some coworkers offered quiet words of support, while others kept their distance, wary of being associated with the conflict. Elijah pressed forward, determined to prove his worth through hard work and integrity. Meanwhile, his family's struggles continued. Uncle Roy's condition was stable but far from improving, and the medical bills continued to pile up. Elijah found himself torn between the demands of his internship and the growing need to support his mother, who looked more worn with each passing day. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, he remained resolute. He had come too far to give up now. One evening, Franklin invited Elijah to his estate for a private meeting. Elijah arrived with a mix of curiosity and apprehension, unsure of what lay ahead. Franklin greeted him warmly in the study, the room bathed in the soft glow of a single desk lamp. Elijah, Franklin began, gesturing for him to sit. I wanted to talk to you about something important, something personal. Elijah sat down, his hands clasped nervously in his lap. What's going on, Mr. Hollis? Franklin sighed, his expression uncharacteristically heavy. You've proven yourself to be honest and capable, traits that are increasingly rare in the business world. But I fear that my company, my legacy, is at risk. Elijah blinked in surprise. What do you mean? Franklin leaned back in his wheelchair, his gaze distant. David has been pushing for changes, aggressive expansions, risky investments. He believes it's the only way to keep the company competitive. But those decisions are putting everything I've built at risk. Hollis Innovations wasn't just about profits, Elijah. It was about creating something meaningful, something that could last. Elijah listened intently, his admiration for Franklin growing with each word. "What can I do?" he asked, though the weight of the question made him hesitate. Franklin smiled faintly. "For now, just keep learning. Gain the skills and knowledge you need to navigate this world. But stay true to yourself, Elijah. That's what will make the difference." Before Elijah could respond, the study door opened and David stepped in. His sharp gaze swept over the room, landing on his father first, then on Elijah. "Father," David said, his tone curt, "I didn't realize you were having a meeting." Franklin didn't flinch. "Elijah and I were just discussing his progress." David's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Elijah. "I hope it's productive. There's no room for inefficiency in this business." Elijah met David's gaze, the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. "I'm doing my best to keep up," he replied evenly. David smirked faintly. "Good. Keep it that way." As David left the room, Franklin shook his head. "He means well, but his priorities are complicated. I hope you'll understand that someday." Elijah nodded, though David's coldness remained unsettling. He left the estate that night with a growing sense of responsibility, not just to himself but to Franklin and the company he was beginning to see as more than just a workplace. The next day at the office, Elijah noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Rumors of financial trouble had begun to circulate, whispers of layoffs and restructuring creating an undercurrent of unease. Miles pulled Elijah aside during lunch, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with quiet concern. "Have you heard?" Miles asked, his voice low. "Heard what?" Elijah replied, his stomach tightening. "David's planning to cut costs by outsourcing some departments," Miles said. "Logistics is on the chopping block." Elijah frowned. Logistics was the department he worked in. "Is it serious?" Miles nodded grimly. "It's not official yet, but it's gaining traction. If it goes through, a lot of us could be out of a job." Elijah's mind raced. Losing his internship would mean more than just a setback. It would put his family's already fragile stability at even greater risk. He couldn't let that happen. Determined to act, Elijah began researching alternatives that could strengthen the department's value to the company. He stayed late at the office, poring over data and brainstorming ideas. His efforts caught the attention of Franklin, who stopped by one evening to check on him. "You're still here?" Franklin asked, his tone both surprised and impressed. Elijah looked up from his desk, his eyes tired but resolute. "I heard about the outsourcing plan. I'm trying to find a way to show how important logistics is to the company." Franklin's expression softened. "You remind me of myself when I was younger. Don't let anyone tell you that hard work doesn't matter, Elijah. It does." Encouraged by Franklin's words, Elijah redoubled his efforts. He compiled a comprehensive report outlining cost-effective improvements for the department, emphasizing its role in maintaining the company's reputation for reliability. When he presented it to Miles and the department head, their reactions were a mix of surprise and approval. "This is impressive work," Miles said, flipping through the pages. "You've got a knack for this, Elijah." Despite the initial success, Elijah knew the real test would come when the proposal reached David. He braced himself for the meeting, determined to prove that his ideas had merit, even if it meant facing David's scrutiny head-on. Elijah's proposal was met with cautious optimism from the logistics team. Miles and the department head both praised his initiative, but they warned him that convincing David would be a different battle altogether. The stakes felt impossibly high. If David rejected his plan, the outsourcing would likely go through, leaving Elijah and many others without work. The meeting with David was set for Friday afternoon, and the tension in the office was palpable. Elijah spent every free moment refining his report, making sure it addressed every possible concern. Franklin's quiet support gave him strength, but David's calculating gaze haunted his thoughts. Elijah knew he wasn't just fighting for his job. He was fighting to preserve the values Franklin had built the company on. The day of the meeting arrived, and Elijah found himself in the conference room, his proposal neatly printed and laid out before him. David entered last, his presence commanding as he took his seat at the head of the table. His sharp eyes scanned the room before landing on Elijah. "You've got the floor," David said curtly. "Let's hear it." Elijah took a deep breath and began, walking through his proposal with steady determination. He outlined the cost-saving measures he had developed, highlighting how they could maintain in-house operations without compromising the company's efficiency. As he spoke, he caught glimpses of Franklin's subtle nods of approval, but David's expression remained unreadable. When Elijah finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then David leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "It's a well-prepared argument," he said, his tone measured. "But what guarantees do we have that your plan will deliver the results you're promising?" Elijah hesitated. "There are always risks, sir," he admitted. "But this company has built its reputation on reliability and trust. Outsourcing may save money in the short term, but it risks eroding the values that set Hollis Innovations apart." David's eyes narrowed slightly, and the tension in the room thickened. "And you think you understand this company's values better than I do?" Elijah's heart pounded, but he held his ground. "No, sir. But I know what it's like to depend on something that feels stable, only to have it taken away. I believe that stability matters to more than just the bottom line. It matters to the people who keep this company running." David leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Elijah. The silence felt endless until Franklin spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "David, Elijah has a point. This company wasn't built on shortcuts. It was built on trust. Trust from our employees, our partners, and our customers. We can't afford to lose that." David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Finally, he nodded curtly. "I'll review the proposal further. For now, the outsourcing plan is on hold." Relief washed over Elijah, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. David's concession felt more like a temporary truce than a victory. Later that evening, as Elijah packed up his things, Franklin approached him in the hallway. "You handled yourself well today," Franklin said, his tone warm. "But I know my son. This isn't over." Elijah nodded, his exhaustion evident. "I'll be ready." The following week brought an unexpected twist. Late one night, Elijah received a call from Franklin, his voice strained. "Elijah, I need your help. Something's come to light and it's serious." Elijah arrived at the estate to find Franklin in his study, a stack of documents spread across his desk. "What's going on?" Elijah asked, concern etched on his face. Franklin gestured to the papers. "David's been pushing for these expansions, but I've discovered discrepancies in the numbers. It looks like someone's been falsifying projections to make the deals look better than they are." Elijah's eyes widened. "Do you think it's David?" Franklin shook his head. "I don't know. But if this gets out, it could ruin everything." Elijah's mind raced. The idea of David being involved in something so unethical didn't surprise him, but it left him with a sinking feeling. "What do you want me to do?" Franklin met his gaze, his expression serious. "Help me figure out the truth. If someone's compromising this company's integrity, we need to stop them." Over the next few days, Elijah worked alongside Franklin, digging through the records. The evidence was damning: altered contracts, inflated projections, and hidden expenses. But the deeper they looked, the clearer it became that the trail led directly to David. Confronting David was a decision that weighed heavily on Franklin. As much as he wanted to protect his legacy, the idea of exposing his own son left him conflicted. Elijah, too, found himself grappling with the moral complexity of the situation. He respected Franklin deeply, but he couldn't ignore the consequences of staying silent. One evening, as they reviewed the final pieces of evidence, Franklin turned to Elijah. "What would you do in my position?" Elijah hesitated, the gravity of the question pressing down on him. "I think doing nothing would hurt more in the long run. This company means everything to you. If you let it fall apart because of this, you'll regret it." Franklin nodded slowly, his expression somber. "You're right, but this won't be easy." Elijah placed a reassuring hand on Franklin's shoulder. "You're not alone in this." As the night wore on, the two of them prepared for the confrontation that would undoubtedly change everything. The days following Franklin and Elijah's discovery were heavy with anticipation. The weight of the evidence against David hung like a storm cloud over the estate, threatening to break at any moment. Franklin had always been a man of integrity, but the prospect of confronting his own son with damning truths shook him to his core. For Elijah, the situation was equally fraught. He had come to admire Franklin deeply, but his growing discomfort with the darker side of the Hollis family's internal politics left him questioning his place in their world. One late afternoon, Franklin called for a family meeting in the estate's grand dining room. Elijah, though not family by blood, was invited to sit in, a testament to the trust Franklin had placed in him. As the staff cleared the table and retreated to the edges of the room, David entered, his sharp eyes scanning the gathering. He sat opposite Franklin, his presence as commanding as ever. "Father," David said, his tone clipped, "what's the meaning of this?" Franklin's gaze was steady, though a hint of sadness lingered in his expression. "David, I've uncovered some troubling discrepancies in the company's financial records. I need to understand your role in this." David's expression hardened. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm asking for the truth," Franklin replied evenly. "The projections for the expansion plans were falsified. Contracts were altered. These decisions jeopardized the company's future and everything it stands for." David's lips curled into a faint smirk, but his eyes glinted with defiance. "Father, this is the real world. Risks are necessary if we want to stay competitive. You've always been too sentimental about the company. It's why we're lagging behind." "Sentimental?" Franklin's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his calm exterior. "That sentiment is what built this company's reputation. It's what kept it afloat through harder times than you can imagine. And it's what separates us from every other cutthroat corporation out there." The tension in the room was palpable. Elijah sat quietly, his hands clenched in his lap, feeling like an outsider caught in the middle of a deeply personal battle. David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "If you can't stomach the realities of business, maybe it's time you stepped aside." Franklin's face fell, the pain of David's words visible. "You would tear apart everything I've worked for, everything I've built, just to get ahead." David's gaze didn't waver. "I would secure its future." Elijah couldn't stay silent any longer. "At what cost?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. All eyes turned to him, but he pressed on. "The people who work for this company trust you to make decisions that protect their livelihoods, not gamble with them. You think cutting corners and inflating numbers is securing the future? It's a house of cards, and you know it." David's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. "Stay out of this. You don't understand what it takes to run a business like this." "I understand enough," Elijah shot back. "And I know that the only thing more important than success is how you achieve it." Franklin raised a hand, signaling for calm. His voice was quieter now, but no less resolute. "David, I won't let this company become something I don't recognize. If you can't lead it with the integrity it was built on, then you'll have to step aside." David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, he stood, his movements sharp and deliberate. "You're making a mistake," he said coldly before walking out of the room. As the door closed behind him, Franklin slumped back in his chair, the weight of the confrontation leaving him visibly drained. Elijah reached across the table, placing a hand on Franklin's arm. "You did the right thing," he said softly. Franklin gave a faint nod. "It doesn't make it any easier." The days that followed were a whirlwind of changes. Franklin initiated an internal audit to repair the damage caused by David's actions. The fallout was messy, but Franklin's determination to restore the company's integrity inspired many within the organization. For Elijah, the experience was a turning point. He admired Franklin's principles, but he realized that the world of corporate politics wasn't where his heart truly lay. One evening, as they sat together in the study, Elijah voiced his thoughts. "Mr. Hollis," he began hesitantly, "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done for me, but I think it's time for me to move on." Franklin looked at him with a mixture of understanding and sadness. "You've learned what you needed to, haven't you?" Elijah nodded. "This isn't where I see my future. I want to build something of my own, something that feels real." Franklin smiled faintly, his respect for Elijah evident. "You have a good heart, Elijah, and that will take you farther than anything else. Just promise me you'll keep in touch and that you'll stay true to yourself." "I promise," Elijah said, his voice steady. As Elijah packed up his things and prepared to leave Hollis Innovations, he felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his to walk. For the first time, he felt free, not just from the burdens of his past, but from the expectations of others. Elijah left Hollis Innovations with a mix of emotions. The final conversation with Franklin lingered in his mind, a bittersweet moment of gratitude and resolve. He was stepping away from the stability the company offered, but his heart told him it was the right decision. For Elijah, freedom wasn't just about leaving a job. It was about forging a path that was entirely his own. Back home, Elijah shared his decision with his family over dinner. The modest meal of rice and beans was filled with warmth and laughter, despite the uncertainty ahead. Clarice listened intently, her face a mixture of pride and concern. "You've grown so much, Eli," she said, her voice soft. "But are you sure about this? It's not easy out there." Elijah nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, Ma, but I want to build something real, something that's mine. I don't want to just follow someone else's vision anymore." Jasmine, ever curious, piped up. "What are you going to build, Gabby?" Elijah smiled, ruffling her hair. "Something that makes a difference, Squirt. You'll see." The next morning, Elijah sat at the small kitchen table with a notebook and a pen, sketching out ideas. He thought about the skills he had gained at Hollis Innovations: organization, problem solving, and an understanding of how systems worked. But more than that, he thought about the people he wanted to help. The neighborhoods like his own, filled with families just trying to get by. The kids who needed opportunities to grow, just as Franklin had given him. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Elijah's vision began to take shape. A community workshop where people could learn practical skills, repairing bicycles, fixing appliances, and even basic coding. It would be a place where knowledge and tools came together to empower those who couldn't afford traditional education. To get started, he needed funding. Remembering Franklin's advice to stay true to his values, Elijah decided against seeking corporate sponsors that might compromise his mission. Instead, he turned to the people who had supported him all along, his community. Elijah spent weeks canvassing the neighborhood, speaking at local gatherings and connecting with small business owners. His pitch was simple but heartfelt. We all have something to contribute, and together, we can build a brighter future for everyone. The response was overwhelming. From small donations to offers of volunteer time, people rallied behind Elijah's idea. He secured an empty storefront on the corner of a bustling street, its faded sign reading Holland Tools. With a fresh coat of paint and some elbow grease, it transformed into The Hub. The Hub became a labor of love, and Elijah poured every ounce of himself into its creation. He worked late into the nights, assembling shelves, organizing donated tools, and setting up stations for workshops. Jasmine often joined him, her small hands eager to help with anything she could reach. "Can I be in charge of the welcome desk?" she asked one evening, her face glowing with excitement. Elijah laughed. "You'd be perfect for it, but only if you promise to smile at everyone who comes through that door." "I promise," she declared, flashing her brightest grin. By the time the Hub opened its doors, the turnout exceeded all expectations. Families from every corner of the neighborhood showed up, curious to see what this new space offered. Kids marveled at the rows of tools and equipment, while parents signed up for workshops on everything from basic carpentry to computer literacy. Elijah stood near the entrance, greeting each visitor with a mix of pride and humility. He couldn't have done this alone, and he knew it. His mother's quiet strength, Jasmine's boundless enthusiasm, and Franklin's guidance had all played a part in bringing his dream to life. Toward the end of the day, Franklin arrived, his wheelchair rolling smoothly over the polished floor. His expression was one of quiet admiration as he took in the bustling scene. "You've done something remarkable here, Elijah," Franklin said, his voice warm. "This is exactly the kind of legacy I hope to inspire." Elijah smiled, his chest swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mr. Hollis. You believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself." Franklin placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "The belief was always there, Elijah. You just needed a little push to find it." As the day drew to a close, Elijah sat outside the Hub, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The soft hum of the city filled the air, mingling with the laughter and chatter of families heading home. For the first time in a long time, Elijah felt at peace. He had taken a leap into the unknown, and it had brought him to a place where he could not only thrive, but also give back. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Elijah knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The hub wasn't just a workshop. It was a testament to resilience, community, and the power of believing in something bigger than yourself.